Hello and welcome to our webinar, Treasures of New England Historic Genealogical Society. My name is Ginevra Morse. I am the Director of Education and Online Programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. We are a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. And I also want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from home with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording of this session on our website. So our presenter today is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February of 2016 as our first curator of special collections. A longtime member of NEHGS, Curt has led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England and Scotland. He's lectured extensively in the United States and abroad, and has taught classes on British culture and art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Curt was previously Executive Director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation, USA, and as Curator of Special Collections here at NEHGS, he provides strategic direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. So as many of you may know, the year 2020 actually marks the 175th anniversary of American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Since our founding in 1845, we have been collecting family treasures from rare 17th century Boston portraits to beautiful early American furniture to relics associated with John Hancock. And today, our fine art collection spans 3 centuries of American history. Over the next hour, Curt will give you a virtual tour of our collection and share the stories behind just some of our hidden gems. At the end, Curt will also provide a few resources if you want to start researching the story of your own family treasures. At any point during the presentation, type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is no handout for this session, but we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can easily go back and review any of this content on our website. All right, I know we have lots to get through, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Curt.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on what is a very gray and depressing day in Boston. I'm sitting here in my home office with my cat, who's already pissed off because I'm not paying enough attention to him. I've only been on the phone 10 minutes, but what I want you to see before you is the grandest space we have at the Society, our Treat Rotunda, which has some of the finest pieces of art that we own on the first floor. And I think it's a perfect way to welcome you virtually into the beginning of this collection. I'm going to show you highlights from 7 different floors of art, and when we reopen again, you'll be able to see almost all these pieces in person. So the focus of this is this book you see before you, Family Treasures, that was just published this month, that has the highlights of the best pieces of art in our collection. And I have to say at this juncture that almost nothing I'm about to give to you would have been possible without Jerry Ward, who wrote this book for us and who did an enormous amount of research over the past 3 years. You can see that the book is broken down into 6 chapters: America in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Massachusetts history, history of the society, coats of arms and family histories, and furniture and clocks. And then our last category, miscellany, little bits and pieces that we didn't know quite where to put anywhere else. And don't be worried, should you be interested in this book, at the very end, we're going to give you information on how to buy the book with a special discount. So let's get started. America in the beginning. Probably the earliest portraits we have are these 2. This is Edward Rawson and his daughter Rebecca. Edward was an English immigrant who came to Massachusetts in the 1630s and became a successful property developer. And his daughter became a big catch because her father was wealthy. She was the 9th of 12 children, but she was considered the prettiest and the smartest. And a visitor from London came in and swept her off her feet. She was, when you see this portrait here, she was only 13 years old. And 7 years later, she married this man in Boston and was taken back to London with him. He was an English lord, and he promised her a wonderful life full of beautiful things and lots of servants. They got to London, stayed overnight the first night in an inn, and when she woke up the next morning, her husband was gone, as was all of her money and her possessions. He was not an English lord. He was not anything to do with, he had a wife, let's put it that way, and he had children, and he was a con man. And he left her there destitute in England for 13 years. What we don't know is why her father, who was still rich back here in Boston, never sent her any money or supported her in any way that we can see. The only thing that makes any sense, knowing the attitude of society at the time toward women, is that he blamed her for this, so therefore she had to pay. Interestingly enough, after 13 years of surviving, because she was pregnant, she had a child, she had a baby boy, she saved enough money from doing needlepoint to come back to Boston. And on June 7th, 1692, on her way back, her ship was stopped in Jamaica to switch ships. There was a huge tsunami that swept her overboard and her child, and they both died together with thousands of other people at Port Royal, and there was an earthquake that swallowed most of the city. So she had a hard life, no matter how you look at it. She was only in her 30s when she died. She's actually the focus of two books. You see on the left there, Leaves from the Margaret Smith's Journal in the Province of Massachusetts Bay by John Greenleaf Whittier, which came out in 1849. And she's the heroine of this book, showing early pioneer grit and determination. This was very popular in 19th century America, and then it's followed up in 2005 by a book by our CEO, Brenton Simons, called Witches, Rakes, and Rogues, where there's an entire chapter dedicated just to her. Probably the most well-researched piece we've ever done on her, and it's wonderful for people visiting the society to be able to see this portrait hanging next to her father. And her father, very sadly, when the portraits were given to us in the 1870s, someone had cut the eyes out of her father to use them as peepholes, like something you would see in a movie from a haunted mansion. We have a rich collection of Americans of all sorts, and this could be considered the earliest American. This is a Native American that we think is Ninigret II. This is a late 19th, early 20th century painting of a very famous painting that was done about 1699 for this Native American who is somebody who's clearly of high social rank, dressed in traditional garb, wearing a mantle and a wampum headdress, earrings and necklace, standing in a forest. What makes this important from our perspective is that the original, which is in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence, is the only example known painted by a European trained artist of a Native American so early. And so popular was this painting that it was reproduced, as you can see here, all over the world, particularly in America and most especially in New England. Rhode Island is where this chief was from. He was a very wise man from what we can tell, and was very suspicious of the white men, but also dealt with them in a very even-handed way. And he's commemorated all over Rhode Island, as you'll see in the next slide. This is the Westerly Rhode Island Public Library, and you can see in the back there a 19th century stained glass window that is an exact reproduction of Ninigret that you just saw in that oil painting that we have. The oil painting that we bought was supposedly considered by Jackie Kennedy for purchase when she was redoing the White House in the 1960s, trying to give a focus on Native Americans and not just dead white men. The other thing that's interesting about this is that this image was reproduced all over the place. We have a wonderful engraving from the 1850s just of his head. He was somebody who was very famous and almost has been forgotten today, and it gives us great pleasure to be able to spotlight him in our treat rotunda, which you saw when we first started the lecture. Possibly the most famous building that you've never heard of was the Hancock Mansion, which you see before you here, which was built between 1734 and 1737 and was on the top of Beacon Hill, where the Massachusetts State House is now. It was the only house when it was built in that area. It was built of solid granite, and it doesn't look that big now, but this was then the largest house in Massachusetts, owned by one of the richest families in Massachusetts. By the time John Hancock, who's most famous today because of his signature on the Declaration of Independence, not to mention the life insurance company that holds his name, by the time he inherited the house, he was so wealthy that he was personally funding a lot of the American Revolution from his own funds. And he also used this house as a meeting spot. Lafayette and George Washington all met here. This was such an important building that when he was dying, he said, I would like this to become the governor's mansion for Massachusetts. Unfortunately, John Hancock did not put that into writing. And for that reason, Massachusetts today is one of only 5 states that does not have a governor's mansion. What happened after he died, it went through a number of different attempts to save the house. The city tried to buy it, the state tried to buy it. There was all kinds of problems going on, but sadly, the last attempt, which was in 1863, was during the Civil War, when America, certainly in Boston, which is the leader of the Union side, was fighting for its life. So the last thing anybody was thinking about was saving an old house. This man you see here, Thomas Oliver Hazard Perry Burnham, or T.O.H.P. Burnham, who was called, not surprisingly, Alphabet Burnham by his friends, was so horrified by this that he produced this broadside. We think this is one of only 2 that survives, and plastered it all over Boston. This is pretty big. It's about 3 feet tall, trying to save this historic house. It didn't happen, of course, because, as I said, not a priority. What's funny to me is that this is maybe an apocryphal story, but it's still worth telling. After the house was torn down and they built brownstone townhouses in its place, he went up, Mr. Burnham did, knocked on the door and asked to see the owner. And after he did, he pointed his finger in their face and said, "You're going to hell. You are sitting on a spot of America's most important house." The interesting thing about this is that those townhouses themselves only lasted about 40 years before they were demolished. And we now have the white marble extensions of the State House that occupy the site. There's a little plaque today in front of the State House that tells you where the Hancock Mansion was. But as oftentimes is the case with historic preservation, this was a sacrificial lamb that helped us down the road, because what you're looking at here with this broadside that says, "Bostonian save the old John Hancock Mansion," is the first example in the United States of an attempt to save historic buildings. So this is the beginning of the historic preservation movement. And if we didn't lose this building, we wouldn't have saved the Old South Meeting House where the Boston Tea Party was planned, because 15 years later, that was going to be torn down. And the way they saved it was, remember, the Hancock Mansion. We can't let that happen again. Very little survives from the mansion. What you see before you here are the steps from up to the front door. That horizontal red line is the ending of the actual steps, and what's above it there are steps that were added in the 19th century when it was added to a park in the Jamaica Plains section of Boston. We have something from the inside of the house as well, which is, I think, infinitely more fun because we own it. And that is this chair called the Hancock chair. Made about 1760, certainly made in England. This is something that after John Hancock's death in 1793 was dispersed with most of the contents of the house. Very few things survive today that can be firmly attributed to having been in the house. This was given to us in the 1880s, and it was covered in leather. And it had always been assumed that it had been covered in leather. And in the 1970s, the leather was rotting, and the society decided to have it reupholstered in more leather. And as part of the process of taking the old leather off, they discovered remnants of this very bright yellow silk that you see here. And were able to take this with the help of Winterthur Museum in Delaware and Colonial Williamsburg to discover that this was originally a worsted damask that had been made probably in the 1760s to cover the chair, and that we have documents from people who visited the mansion saying they walked into this room with this amazing suite of yellow furniture. And on the right there, you see what we believe is one of those pieces. This is the John Singleton Copley entitled Young Lady with Bird and Dog that's today in the Toledo Museum of Art. And we're almost positive that this shows the inside of the Hancock Mansion. So a wonderful representation of that. So the United States isn't that old as countries go. And what you see before you here is a penmanship exercise of a 14-year-old boy named Lemuel Blake. He was a student at the Pleasant Street School. And if you look at the very bottom left arrow I have there, you can see where he's written Pleasant Street School and on the right, his name. We believe that this was an assignment to all the students of the school. Pleasant Street School was something that only taught penmanship, and to be a proper young man, you had to be able to use good penmanship. We believe that this is 1789 when this was done. This is when the Constitution was passed, and that this new country was being born. So that we, the teacher, said to the students, you need to do something that shows this new country. And what Lemuel Blake did is at the very top, you see what he called the federal pillars, which are these columns that have the names of the original 13 states. Then beneath that, the names of the president and vice president, George Washington and John Adams. Then the names of all the senators, and then below that, the names of all the members of the House of Representatives. So what you have before you is literally a snapshot at the creation of America. And of course, nobody could have known at the time that this country would have ended up the country that it is today. What I do love here is because he's trying to show off how good he is. The next to the last arrows show you these serpents that Lemuel has drawn and give you a sense of, he's trying to tell you, I can do more than just write. I can do really cool things. We know that he ended up as a career in publishing, and one of the companies that he founded eventually became Little Brown and Company, which still exists today. And speaking of firsts in America, what you see before you here is a certificate signed at Mount Vernon by George Washington and Henry Knox, who were respectively the president and secretary of the Society of the Cincinnati. And this is the membership certificate of Lieutenant Robert Rogers. So the society was founded in 1783 specifically for men who were descended from French Army and Navy officers and American Continental Army officers who had served 3 years or more in the Revolutionary War. And that's still the case today. This is considered the most prestigious of the lineage societies, and you still have to prove descent from that today. The name comes from the Roman patrician Cincinnatus, who was a patrician who was also a successful farmer who came at a time when Rome was threatened in the 5th century BC, became a general, fought the war, was offered the dictatorship of Rome, but said, I'm returning to my farm. And that's exactly, of course, what George Washington did after the American Revolution. He was offered presidency for life. He was offered to be king. He said, I'm going back to my farm at Mount Vernon. So you see the signatures there of Knox, who later became the first Secretary of War, and then George Washington there on the right. And then my favorite part here at the left, where I have that arrow that's going horizontally, you see a soldier in armor who is trampling a British flag and holding an American flag with the Great Seal of the United States. And then near his left arm, an eagle hurls lightning bolts toward a disheveled and half-naked figure of Britannia and a pathetic British lion who were fleeing in terror. Oh, I just love that imagery. So this is an amazing piece of work. This hangs in our CEO's office. It's one of the most, I think, important pieces we have in the collection today. And speaking of George Washington, this is our most important portrait. We have quite a few of Georgie running around. This is called a porthole portrait, and it was done in 1853 by Rembrandt Peale. Peale came from America's first family of artists. His father, Charles Wilson Peale, was a noted artist in Philadelphia. He started the first museum in America on the second floor of Independence Hall. And all his children were named after famous artists. So we've got Rembrandt here, we've got Titian, we've got Raphael Peale. I love the notes from visitors who came here from Europe after independence. And I'm quoting from one of them who said, every American considers it his sacred duty to have a likeness of Washington in his home, just as we have images of God's saints in ours. And I'm old enough to remember when every school in America had a version of this portrait together with Abraham Lincoln. Those are the only two portraits. And it shows you the iconography and how important it was to have something like this. This is interesting because Rembrandt Peale's claim to fame, especially when this was done in the 1850s, was that he was the only artist alive who had known Washington and had painted him from life. Everyone else had died. So his whole thing was, I can give you the real thing. I knew the man. The first one of these he did is in the collection of the United States Senate, and it was so successful that he did over 70 other versions, of which this is one, because he could make a lot of money from them, and he did. This has the fanciest of any of the frames that I've seen of the 77 versions that exist, and it has the laurel wreath at the very top there showing Washington as a victor in military endeavors. The thing about this that's so cool too is it has an unbroken provenance. The man who commissioned it, Isaac Frothingham, who was originally from Salem, Massachusetts, but who ended up in Brooklyn, it stayed in his family until 1991 when it was donated to us by his great-great-granddaughter. And speaking of the beginning of the United States, this is an exceptionally rare survival. This is a drawing of West Point. This is a pen and ink drawing by L'Enfant, Pierre Charles L'Enfant. And you see here, I've given you an enlargement on the right with that arrow pointing to that same section here. This shows you the S-curve in the Hudson River. This is important because George Washington believed, this is during the Revolution, that this was the most important area in the United States defensively because it was coming up on British-controlled Canada. And he asked Knox to enforce this space. Knox commissioned L'Enfant to draw this. So this is not a pretty thing. This is meant to be a military map to show you how you can enforce this. And though it's very hard to see on this drawing, in the far left, there are little tents where Washington's 10,000 men were camped. This was the beginning of what became West Point. In 1802, the United States Military Academy was founded here by Thomas Jefferson. And it's the oldest military encampment in the United States. It's something that we are amazed that we have this in society because it was given to us by the grandson of the man who commissioned it, by Mr. Knox, General Knox. It was given to us by his grandson, who was Thomas Knox Thatcher, who was an admiral in the American Navy. And there are only two other versions of this that we know exist. One is in the Library of Congress, and one is in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And both of those are slightly larger and are watercolored. This is almost 4 feet long. So when you see it in person on our 5th floor, you can actually look at the details of this and get a much better feeling for it. So why you should know the artist who did this, L'Enfant, is because he also did this. He was George Washington's right-hand man, and after independence, he was commissioned by Washington and the US government to lay out this new city. And the plan that L'Enfant designed is still pretty much in place. Washington has a height prohibition, so you can't build tall buildings, so you don't really mar the view. The layout, the axes that you see here, the white marble, because don't forget, I should say, that Washington saw itself as the new Rome, so lots of white marble. This is what they believed Rome looked like. L'Enfant was born in France, attended the Louvre and the French Academy of Painting and Sculpture, and left school in 1777 to fight for the Americans. At the age of 23, became close to General Lafayette, not surprisingly, and then designed the Society for the Cincinnati, their insignia, which you saw on that certificate a few minutes ago. He died in America, sadly, almost destitute, and his body was moved after his initial burial to Arlington Cemetery, where it still is today. Speaking of great Americans you probably never heard of, I submit to you Governor Andrew. This is formerly Governor John Albion Andrew. And what you see on the left is something we own, which is a plaster maquette or a study about 3.5 feet tall of his grave statue. And you can see the grave statue itself, which is about 14 feet tall on the right there, which is in the old Ship Church Cemetery in Hingham, Massachusetts. Why he's important is because he was what was called the war governor, which meant specifically that he was governor during the American Civil War. And in this next slide, you get to see some of the details of why I think he's so important. He believed that black men were the equal of white men, and he was instrumental in the creation of the first African-American regiment in the Union Army during the war, and also a very powerful figure within Massachusetts for fighting the war. Matter of fact, after the war, Abraham Lincoln said, "Without Andrew, we would have never won the war." My favorite quote of his, as you see down here beneath you, "I know not what record of sin awaits me in the other world, but this I know, that I was never mean enough to despise any man because he was ignorant, because he was poor, or because he was black." He left the office in 1866 and became the president of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Sadly, he only served for a year before he died in 1867. And what you see before you here is a detail of what is considered the greatest sculpture ever done by an American. This is the memorial to Robert Gould Shaw and the Massachusetts 54th, done by Augustus St. Gaudens, considered the greatest American sculptor, and unveiled in Boston Common in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. This has the Common behind it. It faces the State House on the other side, and it's a bronze relief in full scale of Robert Gould Shaw, the white man who led this regiment here on his horse, and the black men that he led, literally walking down Beacon Street on their way to fight. And sadly, almost, I would say the majority of them died. And you see on the left, 1989 movie Glory with Matthew Broderick playing Shaw. And on the right, the back of my Massachusetts driver's license, which has a red arrow that's pointing down to the actual Shaw Memorial. It shows you how important that is in Massachusetts history and the psyche of the state. The other thing that's hugely important about this is the first known representation of black men being displayed facially with unique faces rather than just using a stereotype of a black man over and over again. This is the first time that it was considered sensitive enough and important enough that they should be shown with individual dignity. And speaking of the Civil War, this is one of the more unusual things we have. This is one of the very first things I purchased when I came to the Society with the support of our CEO, Brenton Simons, who pointed it out to me. These are intriguing sketches, and we're not really sure what's going on. We call it Desdemona's Struggle, because we know the woman here was named Desdemona Carter. And we think these are vignettes that were done by a federal government official after the Civil War, when Desdemona was coming to apply for a Civil War pension owed to her as the widow of a soldier. We researched this. We can't find who Joe Carter was. There are too many Joe Carters. It's clear he was a former slave, and we know that Desdemona was as well. And slaves who left the South and who served in the Union Army were promised a pension. Sadly, after the war ended, the federal government reneged on many of those promises as it could, which was easy to do considering most former slaves, of course, couldn't read or write. We think this is somebody who's showing Desdemona's struggle, telling her story of trying to claim the pension that was given to her. What I want you to look at, where I have the red arrow there, is the very last one of these, which tells the most important part of this story. It's coming up, just hold on. Here it comes. So Joe, in that last slide, is shown with one arm missing, and you can see where it says here, he's pictured with the text, "Was introduced to General Forrest at Fort Pillow. So glad to see me. He shook my arm off." So we don't know what happened here, but we do know that Joe very likely served for the Union Army at Fort Pillow, which on April 12th, 1864 was attacked by Confederate forces led by the infamous General Nathan Bedford Forrest. The fort surrendered. Over 300 African Americans were shot in the back as they surrendered or as they ran away. And it became known as the Fort Pillow Massacre. We think that Joe was a survivor of that massacre. He made it to the end of the war. And we think it's a bit of humor when he says, "Was introduced to General Forrest, and so glad to see me, he shook my arm off," because General Forrest, who later became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, would never have touched a black man, much less shaken his hand off. So we think probably that Joe lost his hand at this horrible battle, which was considered by one historian to be the bleakest, saddest moment of American military history. Not surprisingly, considering we're in Boston, we have a lot of Massachusetts history, which I'm going to share with you some of the best bits right now. Among the many unusual things we have is this, the peregrine white cane. So why is it unusual? Well, as you can see in the left here, I say the firstborn child of New England. This is claimed to be made from the branch of an apple tree planted by Peregrine White. He was the first child born to the Pilgrims in America. He was born in November 1620 on board the Mayflower as it was offered off of Cape Cod before they came up to Boston. In 1648, he married and moved to Marshfield, Massachusetts, where he became a farmer and, not surprisingly, planted an apple orchard. And this tree that this was taken from was revered by the beginning nascent movement of American historians. It has a label on it you can see there in the enlargement on the left that tells us that it came to us from Lemuel Shattuck, who is one of the founders of the society and whose daughter gave it to us in 1877. We originally thought this was a 17th century thing, but now we believe this was probably made from this tree in the mid-19th century. We know that the tree itself survived, believe it or not, until 1914. This happy picture is a deathbed portrait. It's not funny, but it's unusual for America. This is Elizabeth Royal at the age of 7. That's how old she was when she died. And this was very common in Europe. After someone wealthy died, they were dressed, put in bed, and then painted as a memorial to them. Very, very unusual in America in this time period. And we think this is the first example in the United States, actually, of a deathbed portrait. The reason it happened is because the royal family was so rich. And we know that her grandfather, who was a slave trader and a merchant, had a coach and six and was considered so grand that he was considered a king as he drove around the greater Boston area. This came to us with her sister, who you'll see in the next picture here. So her sister, Mary, survived happily. And I have this arrow down here to show you how badly people could paint fingers. So you can see her other hand, her right hand is hidden by the flowers, which is another great way to get rid of having to paint fingers. So Joseph Badger, who painted this, was a self-taught Boston artist. Started off as a house painter. Self-taught meaning, we would say primitive, but he was affordable, so you could get someone like him to paint your portrait. Fingers were so difficult, and still are in fact, that even really famous painters would hire someone who came in and just painted fingers. Now, Mary here married another wealthy Bostonian, and they, as with the royals, were loyalists. So when the revolution came, they all fled. They went first, like almost all the loyalists did, to Canada, and ultimately moving on until England, and they never came back. But their house, interestingly enough, is still here. This is the royal house in Medford, built in 1732 by the grandfather of these two girls I just showed you. Amazingly enough, it survives. It was once the center of a grand estate. When you drive there now, it's really sort of funny because you come up, middle-class houses all around it, clearly land that had once been farmed by the royal family. And then you come up, this is a very grand house that's sort of stuck as an oasis in these smaller houses. So what's important about this house, the fact that it survives, it's owned by a nonprofit foundation, it's open to the public, and it has its original slave quarters. This is the only house in New England, actually in the entire northeastern United States, it still has slave quarters attached to it that you can tour. And that's important because though slavery was much less prevalent up here, slavery did exist in New England. We know the Hancocks had slaves, the Hancock branch, and it just isn't talked about as much, and it wasn't as widespread, but it's a very important part of early New England history. So this scary looking man is Captain John Bonner Jr. I have an arrow to point to his fingers as well, because They remind me of vampire fingers. They're so creepy looking. Once again, an unknown artist, probably a Boston-trained artist who may have been self-taught, so not the best. The important thing about the captain here is that it's no accident that to his left you can see water, because he was a famous sea captain. But the most important thing he did, he was the first professional cartographer to draw a map of Boston. And that's why he's famous to us today. And you'll see in the next slide, the 1722 map that he drew was unprecedented for the time. This is the first map that showed not just streets of Boston, but also the harbor and all the wharfs. And what you see before you here is an 1835 version of that 1722 map. This map has always been famous. It's always been reproduced. And the man who did this, Mr. Smith, was born in Danvers, Massachusetts, and was a banknote engraver and made money on the side doing this. The thing about this that I think is really important to remember here is that you can see in the far left here, the city narrows. Boston was a peninsula then, and at high tide, it was an island. And over the years, huge parts of Boston have been filled in. So much like Holland, over 40% of Boston is today filled land. And speaking of Boston, look at this. This was done in 1768. This is a watercolor, one of only 6 that are known to exist, by a Cape Cod man named Christian Remick, who we know very little about, other than he also worked in engravings with Paul Revere. And why this is important at this moment is that what you see here with 3 pieces of paper glued together, you can see those vertical seams going down there because long paper was not able to be manufactured at the time. This is 4 feet long. This was a moment, everything you see in the harbor there are British ships, and they were sent in because of Bostonians' protests against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act and other impositions by the British Crown. Huge regiments came down to occupy the city, and this was the beginning of the American Revolution. This is ultimately what led to the Boston Massacre in 1770 and other events. This is an astonishing survival, and the colors are just brilliant. I love particularly how the water is this emerald green. The other 5 that exist are, 2 of them are in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society, 2 in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and 1 in the interestingly named Club of Odd Volumes in Boston. What you're looking at here is the Samuel Parkman House, which was built in 1788, one of the first grand houses after independence. Samuel Parkman was a wealthy real estate developer and a merchant, and he built this house in the neoclassical style, which was very popular after the Revolution because it was also seen as symbolic of simultaneously Britain and also ancient Rome. This house was on Bowdoin Square, which at the time was considered one of the wealthiest parts. It was one of the wealthiest parts of Boston. Sadly, it diminished over the years, and by the 20th century, the early 20th century, when this house was demolished, it was a very rundown part of town. But at this moment, it was hugely important. And you see down there on the right where I have this arrow, these 2 black teenage boys. We believe that they are the first example in an oil painting in America of freed Black Americans. And you can't see it here, but if you get up close to the actual painting, you can see they're moving luggage. And on the side of the luggage, it actually says Revere House. And that's because across the street, literally across the street from this, was the Revere House Hotel, which we'll see in this next image, which was the grandest hotel in Boston at the time. From that portico, those great columns you see there, John Webster, all the great men of the day were lecturing. It was a focal point. It was the most luxurious place to stay in Boston. Anyone who was famous came here. But across the street, back to the house, in 1849, we have Dr. George Parkman, who was the son of the man who built the house, Samuel Parkman. Dr. Parkman was a very wealthy medical doctor, and he gave the land to form the first Harvard Medical School, which is now where Massachusetts General Hospital is. He's famous today because in 1849, he was found murdered in the laboratory of John White Webster, ironically enough, at Harvard Medical School. And in the first example in the United States that we are aware of using technology that became much more sophisticated in the 20th century. They used dental records and bits of his bone to identify the body, because apparently Mr. Webster White, had used he tried to incinerate the body. This was the big cause celeb of Boston in the 19th century, the big murder trial that ended up in Webster being executed. Even today, there are doubts as whether he did it. Someone could have planted the body in his laboratory at Harvard Medical School. So famous was this incident that when Charles Dickens came to Boston for the first time, the first thing he asked to see was the room where Dr. Parkman had been murdered. This is the finest family portrait that we have in the society. Lemuel Shattuck and his family. You see Lemuel there on the left, his wife on the extreme right, and their 5 daughters in the middle. He was very important because he's one of the founders of the society. He was also a teacher, a bookseller, a publisher, a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives and the Boston City Council. He's most famous because what you see in the upper left there, that is the frieze of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which has his name in 3-foot letters carved on the outside of it. That's because in 1850, he did something called, more commonly, the Shattuck Report, but more officially, the Report of the Sanitary Condition in Massachusetts, which is considered one of the great movements in public health. And he became a very honored member of Boston society. What we know, which is much more fun about this portrait, is that one of the daughters there was married or was about to be married, and the new son-in-law was painted in. The marriage, it's unclear what happened. It didn't take place, or they got divorced, and the son-in-law was painted out, which is why you have that bush sort of in the middle there with nothing in it. In our old building behind the Massachusetts State House, which did not have air conditioning, the old timers of the society will tell you that on warm, humid days, the son-in-law would make a reappearance through the mist of that bush. You won't be surprised to hear that we collect a lot of genealogical history. And the first thing I'm going to show you is one of our most recent acquisitions in this area, and also one of the most important. This is the Folger family tree, which we purchased in 2009. This was done, as you can see, by William Coleman Folger, who was a member of the society for 40 years, and he charts the beginning of his family with the descendants of John Folger, who came here in 1635 from Norfolk, England. The family goes all the way down, and you'll see here why this family is so important in the next slide, because famous things you're probably not even aware of have come because of us. We have over here on the left, James Folger, who went west during the great gold rush, California, and like a lot of people, he discovered it was easier, rather than looking for gold, to sell the prospector or something, so he sold them coffee. And then you have Henry Clay Folger, who was chairman of the Standard Oil Company, who founded the Folger Shakespeare Library. And then, of course, you have Benjamin Franklin. You wouldn't think, but he was a Folger because his mother was a Folger. And he came from an old family that had been in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard since the 1630s. And this city, Boston, is desperately trying to reclaim Benjamin Franklin because he's so associated today with Philadelphia. He was a native of Boston, but of course he moved to Philadelphia, which is where he achieved real success. But in this next slide, you'll see one of our best attempts to get him back. On October 11th, we have, of 1856, the unveiling of the Franklin statue in front of the old City Hall. You can see the statue there in the middle with the arrow on the left. Every learned society in Boston was invited to attend this event, and they all brought their own banners with them, as you can see here. This was such a big event. This was considered a huge reenactment of bringing Franklin back to Boston, and there were, we think, about 20,000 people that attended this. And the society was among them, because one of those banners, we can't tell which one from the drawing, was this banner, which was commissioned by the society in 1856. White silk with gold lettering. It's an astonishing condition for its age, and we know it was the very one that was carried to the society. You'll see in the next slide, everybody who was there from the society, including the man who was carrying that, was wearing one of these ribbons pinned to their breast that honored Benjamin Franklin. It's very hard to see, but if you look at Franklin, there are 4 little roundels on the top and the bottom of him. Each one of them is showing a famous event of his life. The only one that's easy to identify is the upper right, where you see him flying a kite. And we also have this still in our archives today, which is a wonderful keepsake from that very special day. And it's still there today in front of City Hall. This is the original Franklin statue. In 2016, during a windstorm, it blew off its pedestal, and it took quite a bit of restoration to put it back. But it is one of the most visited sites on Boston's Freedom Trail, which shows you all the beginnings of the American Revolution. And it's inspiring. That's all I can say. I'm a Franklin fan. So this is us. This is where we are today at the Society on Newbury Street in Boston in the Back Bay. I say us because this was originally, of course, a different building. This was the architectural rendering that was done by the firm of Henry and Richmond to this bank, the New England Trust Company, saying, this is what we propose to build for you. This firm, Henry and Richmond, were descendants from Guy Lowell, who is most famous today for designing the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and they designed this 3-story Beaux-Arts style building for the bank. In 1963, our buildings, we had more than one, behind the State House, were taken by eminent domain for the expansion of Government Center, and the Society had to find someplace else to live. They bought this in 63, they put 5 stories on top of it, which are still there now, and moved in 1964. What you see here is the original 1928 drawing for the bank lobby, which is remarkably unchanged. What I want to show you is that one in the back left there, that arrow, that's a teller's cage. And you can see people milling about. My favorite figure is this woman here on the far right. It looks like she came out of thoroughly modern Millie. This was a white glove bank, and this woman symbolizes that. That meant that you couldn't just open an account here unless you were invited to. And if you didn't want to have to suffer the indignity of standing in line with a teller to get your money, you could do as this woman was doing here. You could wait and have your money that you were withdrawing brought to you on a silver tray. Look at this, and then look at the same space today. Remarkably unchanged. You see where that arrow is? That's the very same arrow we saw in the previous one of the teller's windows. Those teller's windows, we have converted their offices behind them now. And we put wood there, so we use them as little niches for display of the best pieces of art. And I do think this is one of the most impressive spaces on Newbury Street. Not surprisingly, lots of coats of arms. So let's delve in to the oldest one that we have. This is called the Gookin Hatchment, done about 1690. Now, hatchments are thought to be a corrupted version of the word achievement, which is the proper name for a coat of arms. They originally emerged in the 17th century in England, and they came from the practice of medieval knights of placing, after the knight's death, his shield and his sword over his tomb. By the time this was done in the 17th century, the late 17th century, they got to be markers of death of wealthy people. So this is pretty large. This is about 2.5 feet tall. It's painted on wood, and it would have been hung on the outside of a house, right where that arrow is, for a year after the death of the owner of the house. And this house, Ripple Court in Kent, we're pretty sure is where this hatchment was originally hung for the death of John Gookin, who died in 1690, not surprisingly. And it's interesting because those of you who go to English churches today will see when you go into them, especially parish churches, hatchments all over the place. You can see here on the left at All Saints Church in Surrey, this is very typical because after the year of hanging in front of the house, it had to be moved somewhere and almost invariably went into a church, sometimes into barns. The one on the right there, the hatchment of Thomas Burgh, is an unusually large example, and it's helpful for what I want to illustrate to you, which is that the division in the middle there, showing the left and the right. The left was always the man, the right was always the woman. And in this case, you can see that Thomas Burgh is dead because his side on the left is dark, and his wife is still alive because her side is a light colored thing. That was used throughout hatchments. If you saw in the Gookin hatchment, both sides were dark. That meant that the wife had predeceased the husband. This is one of the most important things we own, the Gore roll of arms. This is the earliest known American heraldic roll and is probably one of the greatest treasures we have. It's one of only 4 manuscript collections that exist that show arms in an American context. Arms are not traditionally issued to Americans. These were done, of course, in the 1750s before we had a revolution where Americans were still entitled to carry arms. The man who did this, John Gore, was a coach painter. This is incredibly valuable because it shows us the early histories of these families. He was also a loyalist, and in 1776, he fled Boston, not very nicely, leaving his wife and children behind. And his son, Christopher Gore, who was a patriot, unlike his father, served as the governor of Massachusetts in the early 19th century and built Gore Place, one of the most important mansions in Massachusetts, which is today a historic house museum that's open to the public that I cannot recommend more highly. One of the most beautiful houses in Massachusetts. What you see here, oops, can we go back, Ginevra, to the next one? Sorry. There we go. Thank you very much. I just want to say a little bit more about the Gore roll. So it's painted, these are watercolors, on very expensive Dutch paper. There are 84 images. They're usually grouped 4 to a page, as you see here. And each coat of arms is accompanied by the name of the family, the occupation of the person at the time, and usually the death of the last most prominent member of that family. And you're looking at pages 22 and 23 here. This is never on view in the society because it's too fugitive, meaning the colors are too easy to fade. But those who are really interested can make an appointment and go up to the 6th floor and see it in the archives. Thank you, Ginevra. This is probably the most unusual piece of heraldic art that we have, and certainly the most valuable. This is quill work, and it was done in 1735 by an 18-year-old schoolgirl named Mary Lemon, which is astonishing when you think about it. 18 years old. She's showing the arms of her parents' families. These would be the Lemons and the Phillips. And on the right, you can see the Phillips, which is a lion rampant with chains. And on the, I'm sorry, that was the left, I apologize. No, I was right the first time. The left side shows the Lemon arms, which has 3 dolphins in it. Thank you, Ginevra. And at the very bottom, she put her initials and the year, 1735. This is one of only 24 that's known to survive from America. These weren't done after independence. And of the 24 that survived, this is one of maybe 3 that is in a hatchment form, which is this lozenge sort of diamond shape that we have. Most of them are in a more traditional shape. So what's so cool about this is how it's made. So quill work is the ancient craft of curling small pieces of paper into coiled designs. And we think it comes about from what was done, certainly in England in the 18th century, was that you use the shaft of a goose quill or a feather to roll the strips of paper. And usually, like here, they were gilded because they were pages that came from a book, and the pages of the book were gilded. And you just have to think what it took to take pieces of paper and roll them this small and this tight. And what you see here in the middle of this is actually a pelican picking her breast of blood when she couldn't find anything to feed her children with. She would give them her own blood, at least that was the thought. And this was a sign in heraldic art of self-sacrifice, something that was considered very important to show that you were willing to sacrifice yourself for your children. The Welch Memorial. This is one of the most talked about pieces we have hanging in the rotunda. John Welch was probably Boston's most accomplished wood carver in the middle of the 18th century. He carved ships, buildings, furniture, and frames. What you see here is a frame. Just the white part was him. And we know that the frames that he made for John Singleton Copley were Copley's favorites. So that gives us a great pedigree to this, that he was oftentimes the carver for Copley's frames. But the middle part comes about much, much later here. Passes down in the Welch family until it comes into the ownership of Charles Alfred Welch in the late 19th century. And we're pretty sure that he commissioned this wood carving of his family's crest. And as you'll see in the detail, the next slide, the most pronounced part of that is this bicorn. A bicorn is not surprisingly a unicorn who has two horns. And I have to say that Charles Welch, 19th century Welch, was a life member of the society, a Harvard-educated lawyer, and one of the founders of Welch and Forbes, which is a Boston-based money management firm which still exists today, and ironically enough, is in the old City Hall where the Franklin statue is. We've got a lot of furniture and clocks, and I'm only going to show you a few pieces here because we could spend all day just on furniture. This is probably the very first piece of art ever acquired by the Society. The Society was founded in 1845. This was purchased in 1846. It was the study table of the Reverend John Pierpont, whose great-grandson was J.P. Morgan, the famous banker. And of course, the P in J.P. Morgan stood for Pierpont. Pierpont was an interesting guy. He attended Yale, went to Harvard Divinity School, was a minister of the Hollis Street Church in Boston from 1839 until 1845, and was a fierce advocate of the abolition of slavery and the temperance movement. Now, it's not sure which one of these got him into more trouble with his parishioners, the fact that he didn't like them to drink or that he didn't want them to own slaves, but he was basically fired in 1845 from his congregation. There he is in a portrait by Matthew Brady, looking just what you would think a temperance preacher would look like. His church sadly doesn't exist anymore. You see that there on the right. After he was considered a really important Boston preacher and just a member of society in general, and after he left, it was considered so important that some of his things be kept here. And at the auction of his contents, this table was bought, mainly because the people who bought it held him in such high regard. Amazing enough, at the age of 76, he became a Civil War chaplain, and he died at the age of 81. An amazing story, actually, that needs to be talked about more, I think. We got a lot of clocks. What you would call, I would call a grandfather clock. This is what we call a tall case clock. This was made by Simon Willard, who was one of the leading Boston clockmakers of his day in the early 19th century. He was originally, I said John Wharf, I do apologize, it's actually Simon Willard. John Wharf was who he made it for, and John Wharf was the owner of a cod fishing business in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I'm laughing because there's nothing wrong with being the owner of a cod fishing business. He was very successful, which is how he could afford to commission this clock. It was given to us in 1918 by his descendant, Philip Wharf, which you can see in this silver tag. Then it had another twist in its story. In 1982, the Society sold it, and it went into a private New York collection. In 2017, one of the trustees of the Society happened to be going through Sotheby's, looking at the latest sale exhibition coming up, and saw this clock and saw this plaque that said New England Historic Genealogical Society. And this person very kindly gave us the money to reacquire it. So almost 100 years after it was given to us, it came back. This is certainly the most unusual tall case clock that we have. It's almost 9 feet tall, which is really tall for a grandfather clock. It strikes every quarter hour, which I'm sure if it was running, which happily it's not, would drive people crazy. It sits in our boardroom, so we wouldn't be able to have any meetings. It also, every fourth hour, it plays a tune, in 11 different tunes, my favorite being God Save the King. This was made in the 1740s, 1750s in Devon, England, which was very much in the middle of nowhere at the time, by a man named Edward Upjohn, who was unusual because he not only made the clock and the works and the dials, he even cast his own bells. And this particular clock, because of its chinoiserie decoration, which is this attempt by Europeans to try to imitate ancient Chinese and Japanese lacquer, which they didn't do a very good job of, was something that was in the latest style. So you see on the left here a close-up of the case of the clock, and you see on the right a drawing from this book that came out in 1688 called A Treatise on Japanning and Varnishing by two authors called Stalker and Parker. This is the first example in Europe of an illustrated example of this exotic art that we call chinoiserie, and we're almost positive that whoever made the case of the clock, which is very likely not the maker of the clock himself, used this book and maybe even this specific illustration you see here to paint what you see on the right. So let's delve into some unusual things that don't fall into any other category, starting with a fire bucket. Thankfully, fire buckets aren't well known today because we have fire engines and fire departments to help us. But what you see before you here is a fire bucket. This was owned by Peter Junot, who was a French Huguenot Boston distiller. Actually, he wasn't a Huguenot himself. He was a descendant of Huguenots who came here. And it's interesting because we know in 1760, which is about the time this was made, that there was a horrible fire in Boston that was said to have destroyed about 350 houses in what was then a very small town. And because of this fire, 9 separate fire companies were established to try to fight fires. And we're pretty sure that Junot was a member of one of these fire companies. Everyone who was rich had 3 to 5 of these buckets hanging in a hall on hooks high up in case of a fire. And the idea was you grab them. If it was your house, you had cloth bags, usually linen bags, inside of these buckets that you would put your valuables like silver in, and you would get out of the house. If it was a neighbor's house that was on fire, you would take the buckets, you would go to the site of the fire, and you would pass the buckets around, and they'd be filled with water in an attempt to put the fire out, which, of course, as you can imagine, wasn't very successful, usually because of the nature of swinging a bucket on a big fire. But you left your buckets there until the fire was put out, until the house burned down. And the next day they were returned to you, which is why you see the name of the bucket. This is unusually fancy with gilding and with sort of Baroque scroll work. So this shows you, I think Peter wanted to show you what a rich man he was. Unfortunately, for our story, he was another loyalist. He left this behind when he fled Boston for Nova Scotia in 1776, never to return again. And his father, who was a patriot, you see this a lot, happens in civil wars a lot too. Families break up over which side they're on. His father saved this bucket, and even though his son never returned, it found its way to us in the 1870s by a family member. Fabrice de Mer. So very fine looking man here. He was painted in Rome when he was about 30 years old by his father-in-law, George Peter Alexander Healy. Fabrice was becoming a very important French portrait painter. His father-in-law was one of the most important painters of his day, certainly in Boston. His great claim to fame, as you see there, is that he painted from life every United States president from John Quincy Adams to Ulysses S. Grant. His grandson, he was the grandson of Gilbert Stuart, who was one of the most important painters ever in Boston's history. And he's most famous to us today, although probably not known as the artist, because of his 1877 portrait you see on the right here of Abraham Lincoln that was used as the model for the 1959 stamp that was issued by the U.S. Postal Service to commemorate his 150th birth. This is an unusual survival. This is a Civil War diary of Adolphus Strassmann, who was a Hungarian Jew who was born in 1848 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and came to America with his family as a young man and settled in Fall River, Massachusetts. He enrolled in 1863 in the Massachusetts Volunteer Heavy Artillery Regiment to fight for the Union in the Civil War. He was only 15 at the time. He lied about his age because he needed to help his family financially. And if you signed up and stayed for 3 years, in addition to your regular salary, you got a bonus of $300, $100 for every year you served. This is part of the Jewish Heritage Center collection at NEHGS. And even though the Union Army was heavily Protestant, there were Jews and Catholics that came in from urban regiments like this. We have here his very sparing descriptions of the war, most of which he served in North Carolina. He made it through the end of the war and was discharged on September 3rd, 1865, returned to Fall River, where he remained for the rest of his life working as a druggist and a real estate agent, and he died in 1923, which is pretty amazing because he died after the First World War, and we actually have films of commemorations of soldiers marching from the Civil War in battles, in commemorations of the ending of the First World War, and he could have been one of those soldiers. So an incredible span of a lifetime of American history that he lived. And the last time I'm going to show you is this. This was Abraham Brzezinski, who was an important Bostonian who served under President Herbert Hoover as the American ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1930 until 1932. These were very, very tough years. This was in the years leading up, of course, to the Second World War, and the Czechoslovak Republic, which had just been founded in 1918, created this, the White Lion First Class Medal, in 1922, specifically to honor foreigners. I think it's important to talk about the man himself. He was Jewish. His parents were immigrants that came from Russia. He was important because in 1895, he co-founded the United States Trust Company, which was the first bank in Boston that would serve immigrants who were turned away by other banks. And I actually had an account at the U.S. Trust Company. They were around until about 15 years ago before they were absorbed by another bank. He later became a Republican politician in the legislature, helped to save the USS Constitution, but is most famous to us today in Boston because of his crucial role in spearheading the relief efforts for Halifax, Nova Scotia in December of 1917. And you might ask, what happened in December of 1917? And the answer is that there were two ships that collided in the harbor, an explosion that resulted, it was so huge that it leveled much of the Canadian city, killing about 2,000 people and injuring 9,000 more. This man helped assemble a relief train that brought doctors, nurses, and medical supplies from Boston, fighting its way through a blizzard and deep snowdrifts to reach the city. And to this day, every year, the city of Halifax sends the city of Boston a Christmas tree in gratitude and thanks for the efforts of what this man spearheaded from the city of Boston. Like a lot of institutions, most of what we have is in storage. And this is a photograph of our storage facility in an undetermined location. This, I hesitate to point out, is not all ours. We share this with a number of other cultural institutions, but it shows you the huge reach of almost every cultural institution of the depth of the collections that you won't even see on a daily basis. For those of you who are interested in trying to find out more about pieces of art you may own that you think are important, the first two things I list here are websites from the American Association of Appraisers and the International Society of Appraisers. You can go there and type in where you live or what you're looking for an appraisal on, and they can direct you to somebody in your area who either specializes in this, or if you're willing to send photographs, you can actually communicate with any appraiser anywhere. If you're looking to sell, I have three firms here, Bottoms, which is all around the United States and in London, Freeman's in Philadelphia, and Skinner here in Boston. Auctioneers oftentimes will give you free appraisals. The ones above there are going to charge you. An appraiser is going to charge you by the hour, oftentimes $100 to $200 an hour to do an appraisal. So the ones beneath you there, oftentimes if you're interested in selling, will give it to you for free, even if you're not selling. If they think it's important enough, you can take it into their offices and they'll give you their opinion of it. And this is me, in case you weren't sure, that's my end, my rear end in this case. This was something, when we were photographing for this book, the photographer said to me he had to have this table exactly perfect so the legs were just perfectly put together. This was like 6 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and he very kindly snapped me with my ass in the air, and I thought I should end there just to make everybody happy.
Well, thank you, Curt, for your fantastic and entertaining presentation. So many stories. I know that we're over time, but I still want to get to a few questions before we say goodbye for the day. Before we get to those questions, just a few notes. We've been talking about some of the fantastic pieces from our collections that have been photographed and written about in this book, Family Treasures, 170 Years of Collecting Art and Furniture at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, which is just hot off the presses. And we would like to offer all of you a special discount, so you can save 10% on this book by using the promotion code TREASURES20, and you can do so at the time of online checkout, or you can also call our bookstore. You see the number there. I'll also include this information in my follow-up email to you. And if you are a member of American Ancestors and already received 10% off our books and products. This is actually, this discount is in addition to that savings. So certainly check that out if you're interested. I think that could make a lovely book or perhaps Mother's Day gift if you're in the market for such a thing. And I'd also like to invite you to participate in our upcoming special webinar series, British Houses and Heritage with Curt DiCamillo. And you can sign up for this free series and view all of our upcoming online programs at americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. We have 2 coming up in May, 1 in June, and hopefully we'll schedule some more for the future. All right, so let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type anything into the chat panel or into the questions panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Now, we have a few people asked about the Gore roll, which you showed, Curt, that had kind of entries of American heraldry or heraldic entries, and they've asked if that has been transcribed and digitized. I can answer this question. Yes, it has been transcribed and digitized and actually made as a searchable database on our website, americanancestors.org. You do have to be a member of American Ancestors in order to access that, but you just log in, you can browse our databases, you can type in Gore and go right to that database, and there are beautiful high-res images of each of the pages, and you can kind of browse the book that way. Now, Curt, a question for you. So Lisa asks about family Bibles. Are family Bibles something that we at American Ancestors collect? And how might she go about, and if so, how might she go about donating a family Bible?
I can't speak for the archives, which are the division of our institution who collect Bibles, but Bibles are hugely important history of American families, and not surprisingly, the more prominent the family, the more we're interested in the Bible. What we would do is recommend that you contact the archives, and we can give you that information offline. Upstairs on the 6th floor, they're the ones that collect this, and they can tell you if it fills a specific hole in our collection. And oftentimes it will be digitized. You heard Jennifer saying that about the Gore roll. It was a really important Bible. We're very happy to have it. I will say there are thousands and thousands of Bibles out there, so the archives is very particular about the pieces that they accept, and that's something I think it's important to say too about anything, whether it's in the archives or in the fine art collection that I oversee. We have a lot of people offering us stuff all the time. We have a collection policy, and if we accepted everything that came to us, we would be pushed out of house and home in a week. So we try to be very specific and focus on areas that we need filling in holes in the collection, or things that are already focusing on things that we collect.
Yeah, and if you are interested in donating items, either family Bibles or other materials that you might have, certainly you can learn more about our donation policy on our website. And of course, the main thing is whether it's our organization or other historical societies or archives or other repositories, is always to contact them first. You want to make sure that your treasures are going to a good home, and that there's the space, and that your item might be either digitized or made available. So certainly communicating with any of the organizations is kind of a key first step, and certainly looking at casting a wide net, looking at local repositories, maybe specific to where that family lived. So there are lots of different ways that you can find kind of the best home for some of your treasures.
And I'm going to add on to that best home, if I may, Ginevra. If you can think back to the porthole portrait of George Washington that I showed you by Rembrandt Peale, that was offered to a major museum in America and accepted by them. And then the donor family asked them if it would be on view. And the museum said, well, no, it'll be a very important part of our study collection, which meant it was going to be in a storage basement somewhere. And they gave it to us instead, because we said this will be really important for us. It will never go off view. So I think that's what you're looking for, is an institution that's going to cherish what you have and make it feel like it's an important part of their collection and acknowledge your family's role in that.
And Kenneth asks, for the Rembrandt Peale portrait of Washington that you showed, and the gorgeous frame, do you happen to know who made that frame?
We don't know who made the frame. It's interesting you ask that. The frame is a combination. It's a basic wood frame, but it's got most of it's gesso, which is sort of a heavy-duty plaster that had oftentimes horsehair to make it stronger. So that was probably formed in a mold and then glued on to the wooden frame, and then it all would have been gilded together. But we don't know. We know that Peale offered a variety of frames that he could sort of source for you, and we think he used makers. And it may have even been like a drawing that he would have submitted. You could say, I want frame C. But beyond that, we don't know much. We actually had the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston look at this frame recently to try to figure out where it came from, and we couldn't come up with any answers, unfortunately.
Now, maybe just one final question before we wrap up for the day. Several people have asked about, do you have portraits of this person, or do you have something, made by or representing this individual? What's the best way to learn about some of the specific items in our collection? Can you look in the catalog? Should they contact you? What's kind of the best way to really learn if we do have something regarding their ancestor?
The best way is to contact me because the book that this lecture has been focused on, Family Treasures, is the first time in 175 years that we've actually done something publication-wise that focuses on the collection. And this book has 78 objects in it. We have about 800 objects in the collection. So there's a lot that's not in this book. And it's all in a database, but at this point, it's not available to the public. It's only available internally. We hope to one day in the next year or two, make it available so it will be searchable together with the library databases. It will be in the same format. But at the moment, the best thing to do is to email me or call me and ask me what you're thinking about, and I can reply to you directly on any specifics.
Well, thank you, Curt. And I do also want to mention that if you are interested in seeing what we have in our manuscript collection, which is somewhat distinct from our fine art collection, so if you're wondering if we have maybe diaries or letters or papers about a certain family that's in your heritage, you can go to our library catalog, that's library.nehgs.org, and do a search and just narrow it down to our manuscript items. But of course, you can also do a wider search and see if we have other published resources that pertain to your family. So thank you again, Curt, for your fantastic presentation. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. If we didn't get to your question, or if you'd like more hands-on help with your research, you can always consider scheduling a consultation with one of our experts, or even hiring our research services team if you'd like research done on your behalf. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And I also want to mention that this free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free, and also to support the creation of more free programs for you and other audiences. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.